Father, we thank you for the history of the church. We pray that you would help us to learn from the mistakes that we might not make them again, and from the successes that we might know how to serve you properly. Help us today, Father, as we go through what was really a very bad period in our church's history, to understand how to be Christians in this world. We pray it in Jesus' name.
Amen. Amen.
And so if you're looking at it, we have a list of topics where we're at. The papacy, first of all. Rome is preeminent over Constantinople, but that's a continual battle. Papal power rivals secular leaders. That's an issue. And the Pope has immense influence in the church. He's not as influential as he was to become, but he has immense influence. The priests, and this is stuff we saw last week, are a special class, way above the laity. You lot are ordinary, we're fantastic. That's the way it was back then. The monastics, some of the best minds withdrew from life and from the church. And so whatever scholarship they did was often esoteric, it wasn't related to real life, and it didn't filter through to the church because they were sort of out doing their own thing. And they had no influence on the secular world. Language has changed, and so now at the beginning of the 7th century, Latin is the language of the church. Everything is in Latin. Only scholars understand Latin. So none of the congregation understands what's going on. Even most of the priests don't speak Latin. They learn the services off by heart and just do them by rote. Mysticism and magic's become a big thing. Prayer to the saints are there between you and God. Relics become important, and icons. We'll talk about icons a little bit later. So it gives rise to 5 problems: corruption, heresy, magic and superstition, and learning divorced from the life of the church. And the good news is it gets worse. That's the way it was at the beginning of the 17th century. All right, so we look at Gregory the Great. We looked at Gregory the Great last week, but we're going to take it to the next step this week. From between 400 and 600, there was conflict between the East and the West. The West was weakened by invasion, and the imperial palace was at Constantinople, so the emperor isn't even, or the head of government isn't even in Rome, in the centre. It's off to the side. The Bishop of Rome, however, has precedence over everybody else. Pope Gregory was from an aristocratic family. He's the first pope to have been a monk. He was very able, but he claimed universal jurisdiction over Christendom. That is, he controls all Christianity. And that sets up the future of the papacy. He's the one who sets it on the track. So, we're looking at what people, Roman Catholics will tell you, have been around since Peter started it all. It really is being set up here in the 7th century. But here's why I wanted to talk about it. I'll come back to that. He gave medieval Catholicism its distinctiveness: cult of saints and relics, demonology, ascetic virtues. But the big thing he did was he converted, was important in the conversion of England. There are myths. that Joseph of Arimathea, or even Jesus himself, went to England. And there are places in England will tell you, Jesus was here. Highly unlikely that Joseph of Arimathea went there. Jesus didn't go there. But they are strong myths, and there is a very, very funny, completely blasphemous skit, but Peter Cook and Dudley Moore do a wonderful thing about discovering a chair that Jesus made. And the workmanship is hopeless. I hope he's a better saviour than he is a carpenter and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah. Anyway. The Roman occupation from 43 to 410, the Roman soldiers would have brought with them their own religions. So there would have been the original pagan religions in England, and also then some of the Roman pagan religions. And then probably some Roman soldiers were Christians, quite possible, and they would have brought some Christianity. And in 314, 3 bishops are sent to the Synod of Aries. Now, they are probably sent by the Celtic Church, which is from Ireland to England, but we don't know. All we know about them is that they were really poor and they needed money to get there. And some of the European churches put money in to get them there. But the point is, by 314 they've got some bishops, they've got 3 bishops. So obviously Christianity is there, but it's not really a big time thing. In 415, at the Synod of Jerusalem, they determine that Pelagius is a heretic. Pelagius denies original sin and emphasises human choice in salvation. He's English. So there's the first great heretic. So what I'm saying is there is Christianity there, but we know very little about it. The Romans withdrew. They withdrew because the army was too stretched. It's a big empire. They were being attacked. They needed to bring people in from the extremities, and England was an extremity. And so by the middle of the 6th century, there was no Roman presence in England at all. Now, there's a legend. The legend is that Pope Gregory saw in the marketplace some attractive child slaves. And he said, "Who are they?" And he was told, "They are Angles from England." And he is supposed to have said, not Angles, but angels. Now, you can believe that if you want to, but it's a wonderful legend. I prefer the Seller and Yateman version from 1066 and all that, where he says, not angels, but Anglicans. In 595, he orders the purchase of some of these children to be trained as clergy. In 596, he sends 40 monks to evangelise England. They're under the leadership of Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, the great man, but another Augustine, who becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. They target Kent. If you've got your map from last week, you can find it. If you haven't, tough. You couldn't get it up even if it was there. They target Kent because the King of Kent is Ethelbert, King Ethelbert. And he was married to Bertha, lovely name, who was a Frankish princess, but she was Christian. So it didn't take very long for Ethelbert to get converted, and then with him 3 provinces, Kent, Essex, and East Anglia, become Catholic. So these 40 missionaries are extremely successful, and Pope Gregory is responsible for sending them. Now, at the same time, Celtic Christianity was in existence. and the centre of Celtic Christianity is Ireland. And Ireland sends missionaries to evangelise Scotland and northern England. Columba is probably the most famous, 521 to 597. He was born in Ireland, but in 563 he left Ireland. Voluntarily? Probably not. There are sort of suggestions he got kicked out, but anyway. He takes 12 companions and sets up on the island of Iona, which is a small island off the west coast of Scotland. He establishes a monastery there, and that becomes the base for evangelisation of the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, and the Scots. And there are many churches established in the western part of Scotland. Now there is a certain, the Celtic people are allied to Scotland. A lot of the Celts go to Scotland, and so that's a logical place for them to work. And northern England, up around the Newcastle region, down into York, also fits them, so they fit there. So now you have two churches. You have the Roman Church in the south and the Celtic Church in the north. And they don't want anything to do with each other. Still going. They don't want anything to do with each other. We may do the whole thing with that. They do agree to adopt the Roman date of arriving at Easter, which is good. The Orthodox Church still hasn't done that. They adopt the Roman traditions around baptism, but they refuse to join the mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons who were coming across and settling in England. The Celtic Church had a much longer tradition than the church in the south. It did wither under the invasion of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes. And by the late 7th century, the end of the 600s, they had combined. And Aidan of Lindisfarne, which is on the east coast of Scotland, was very important in the mission to the Anglo-Saxons. The Synod of Whitby in 664 confirmed the Romanisation of Britain. So British Christianity by 664 was Roman Christianity. So the Celts had sort of succumbed to Rome. There were two centres. The cathedral in Canterbury was built in 597, the cathedral in York in 735. To this day, there are only two archbishops in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York. All of the other bishops are just bishops and not archbishops. So see, we're way ahead of them. We've got lots of archbishops. Every capital city has its own archbishop. The new church had vigour and scholarship. And an example of it is the Book of Kells. And if it was working, you could see some of the Book of Kells up there. The Book of Kells is what's called an illuminated manuscript. And it's really incredibly intricate work. And so the first letter on each page is sort of big, and it's really quite exciting. I remember they brought a little bit of it out to the National Library in Canberra, and I can remember lining up to have a look at these few pages of the Book of Kells with 5 young children who could not give any. But we saw it. It's stored normally in the University Library at Trinity College in Dublin. And so when I was at Trinity College in Dublin, there was no queue to see the Book of Kells, and I couldn't be bothered. But anyway, it was very, very significant. Doesn't do anything to enhance the gospel, but it's incredibly arty and all that sort of thing. The Lindisfarne Gospels were the same. They produced a church historian, the Venerable Bede. A lot of what we know of early English Christianity is in his writings. We're gradually discovering most of it's wrong, but that's all right. He was a very good historian for his day. And then, in the 8th century, guess what? The English church actually went over and revitalised the European church. So they really had come a long way. All right, so that's the evangelisation of England. What we'll do, we won't spend any more time on England really until next term when we come to modern history. And next term we're going to be as selective as all the ancient historians, and we'll only look at England. When we look at the Reformation, we'll only look at England, a little bit of America and a bit of Australia, but we'll only look at the bits that concern us, and we'll just mention in passing other things. The late 9th century to the mid 11th century was the age of darkness. Christianity weakened to the point of being, well, not Christianity. The members of the old empire were in trouble. Now, you need to understand that when the Roman Empire broke up, a whole lot of countries that had been part of it and held together by it became independent. And there is no longer a major military power, so they're all fighting their own battles. Just like the Soviet Union breaking up, and now you have Ukraine and Georgia and all those other places. You see the problems with Ukraine, battling Russia. The others aren't coming to their aid, but they were once part of the Soviet Union. Same principle. And that happens in the Roman Empire. It breaks up, and each nation has to go and do its own thing. The Muslims are attacking from the east, and the Hungarians are attacking from the sort of northeast, and the Norsemen are coming from Scandinavia. So the whole place is in a mess. And in fact, it's in such a mess that scholars believe that 1000 AD is the time when the Earth's going to end. Hopefully, because it's in such a mess. Still going. So the Earth is going to end in 1000 AD. It's in such a mess.
Well, better hurry up.
The papacy,
already gone.
the papacy is involved in power struggles in such a way that the Pope becomes captive to whoever's in power, and the papacy loses a lot of its power for a period, gets it back, loses it again, and when we come to the Reformation, the reason that the Pope can't grant Henry VIII his divorce is because his wife Catherine of Aragon is the cousin or whatever, niece or whatever of the King of Spain, and the King of Spain is more powerful than the Pope, and so the King of Spain said, don't give that divorce, and the Pope says, I won't. And so you have the Reformation. We'll do it in more detail next term. But it's happening here. In the 10th century, there is almost a complete collapse of civil order and culture. And the church suffers most of all. Church property is seized by nobles for money. Take the church property and sell it. Why not? The clergy become indifferent to duty. The ignorance increases. The immorality increases. These are the people leading the congregations. As I said, the papacy became the plaything of the Roman nobility. There were incompetent popes, there were immoral popes, although it still had some sort of existence. Eventually, the papacy was restored by Germany, of all places. The Eastern Church, then, we've seen throughout there's a problem between East and West. Did I mention I hate Microsoft? When you have the centre of empire in Rome, everything's in Rome, but with Constantine, he actually builds a new imperial palace in Byzantium, which he renames Constantinople, which we've now renamed Istanbul. Once the emperor is living in Constantinople, he's actually not in the centre of the empire. And so there are all sorts of tensions, and the Eastern Church, which is centred on Constantinople, gets a lot stronger. The Western Church declines. And eventually they split. The East has a much greater interest in monasticism. It's much easier to be a monk in the desert than it is in the big cities. And in the East, liturgies developed. Now, I've said when we looked at life in the church, most of the stuff might have been the same every week, but it was extemporary. There was no liturgy as such. In the Eastern Church, liturgies develop, and liturgies from the 4th century are still being used in the Orthodox Church for 2 or 3 feasts a year. They actually use a liturgy that was developed in the 4th century. Now, liturgies are important because they keep everybody doing the same thing, and so there's some sort of unity. A lot of people migrated from the East to the West because they didn't like what was happening in the church in the East. And much of the church in the East by 800 was under Muslim rule, including places like Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. And the final split between East and West comes with the Crusades. And we'll do the Crusades in the next hour, and I'll explain why there was a split. Now, I don't want to say much else about this. This is selective, you see, it goes off on its own. The Eastern Church has never had a Reformation. And so the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, is still living back in the pre-Middle Ages, the Middle Ages, and still doing the things that they did back then. So I'll mention just 3 things before we leave them. The first is that when I was here at Port Kembla, teaching scripture at Port Kembla High School, there was a whole group of Greek Orthodox kids which the school didn't have a clue what to do with, so they stuck them in Anglican scripture. And it was great. I learned a lot. I just sat there and asked them questions and open mouth, listened to the blessing of the fish and fleet and all the other stuff they did. I once went to a Greek Orthodox service. It was a funeral service for the mother of my assistant at the time, Diana Colliers, and it was very interesting. I understood about 1/3 of the words because modern Greek or medieval Greek was different to the New Testament Greek that I knew. And the stuff they went through was quite amazing. And I just sat back and watched. And one of the traditions I did not take part in, everybody lined up and kissed the body in the coffin. And I stood there and bowed my head, but they still do what was done back then. And the other thing to make it, when I was teaching scripture at Annandale, when I was rector of Annandale, there was a Greek Orthodox class, and an old Greek Orthodox priest used to take it. We used to have a cup of tea every week. And one day he said to me, Denis, the kids want to learn the Bible, and I want to teach them the Bible, but they want to learn it in English, and I don't speak very good English. He didn't say it like that, but those were the words. And so I said, I'll fix that. So I bought him a full set of Arch books. Now, probably most of you have never heard of them, but they were like Dr. Seuss. They were Bible stories told in verse with drawings. Very well produced. They were Lutheran, and there's no doctrine. It was just straight Bible stories. Brilliant. And he was so excited because his kids loved them, and he loved them, and so on. And then one week he came in and he said, I'm in trouble. I got hauled before the Archbishop because I can't teach with stuff that's not Greek Orthodox approved, and therefore I can't use it. And it was just so sad. And he was so upset because he was really enjoying doing that. But that's the Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on. And it's basically unreformed. It's not as bad as the Roman Church got, but it's still, the gospel is still there, but it's a long way from what's hidden. They took icons seriously, and icons are holy objects. They can be statues, they can be paintings, incredibly done. A lot of them have been lost, of course. When the Reformation came, they were just simply destroyed. But in churches, there were statues, there were carvings, there were paintings, there were windows, there were ceramics. Some monasteries actually made a living out of selling them. If you ever go to Istanbul, there are a couple of old Christian churches that were turned into mosques. And when they were turned into mosques, all of these things were covered over, painted over or cemented over. And now that they've been turned into museums, they've actually taken the covering off and some of the original, and they are absolutely magnificent. The mosaics in particular are absolutely magnificent. And I suppose it's an age when people have time to do this sort of thing. But the problem with icons is that they very quickly become idols. So those who like them say, look, they help you to focus your faith. Those who don't like them say they're idolaters. The closest I can, and when we finally get this to work, I'll show you some, but in the Catholic Church you have the 7 stations of the cross. Okay, now they are icons, they are idols. When I was locum at Tea Gardens, at Easter, the Catholic Church put on a thing out in the, I think it was in the school grounds of Bulgadila, and they just simply had various stages of the cross, and we went around and they involved Protestant clergy. We all had to speak at a bit and so on. And it was really fascinating because you actually did focus on the 7 stages of the cross, and so it was quite useful. And so they can be useful, but of course they can become idolaters. They're familiar in Orthodox churches now, and they're familiar in a lot of Catholic churches. We'll come to the end of the Dark Ages then. There's nothing else to tell you about the Dark Ages. No heresy. Well, heresy develops, but it's not intellectual. It's just nobody knows what they're doing. It just becomes hopeless. So by the end of the Dark Ages, what you have first of all is untrained clergy. Clergy have no training at all. Now, imagine having a church like this and having a rector who didn't have a clue what he was doing. Completely untrained. We'd all suffer. We don't know how good we got it, let me tell you. I was going to say something else, but John's got that going, so I don't want to give him too much to cut out later on. Simony, the purchase of church positions. The way the church made money was that it actually sold positions. So you paid a lot of money to get a job, which then usually made you a lot of money because of corruption. There is general sexual laxity. The reality is when you take the Bible out of society, there is nothing to make you moral. Most of you are old enough to remember back to when the 1950s, when there was sort of orthodox morality, and then the 60s it all exploded. Now, the reason for that is that it had only been around since the evangelical revival of the late 18th, early 19th century, that sort of morality. Prior to that, the church was lax. And that morality, that was so successful, that revival, that morality seeped through society. And whatever you knew the Bible and you knew the background to it, that morality made sense. But by the 1950s, people are removed from that. And so as a kid, when I said to my parents, why can't I do that? The answer was, because we said you can't. To which I said, big deal. I'll do it. They couldn't explain any of it. And so I had no understanding of why I could do some things and not other things. And so in the 60s, it just all breaks out. And you have the beginning of what we now have. Because nobody knows why morality is there. What happens when you get rid of the There's lay control of the appointment to senior positions, and that leads to control of those positions. There's a monastery in France that starts renewal, guided by canon law and scriptures. They say, all right, the Pope is superior to all secular rulers, but the Pope has to be chosen by clergy and people, not by the king. They say ceremony is wrong, but they say celibacy is absolutely essential. 1066. William the Conqueror is sanctioned by the Pope to go and conquer England. And so when William the Conqueror conquers England, England becomes subservient to the Pope. All right, so we talk a lot about William the Conqueror. They don't mention that. But with him comes subservience to the Pope. Although the king, it's weird, the king still has a certain amount of power. And it's sort of, the king allows the Pope to have that. It's really quite weird, but that's what happens. The peak of papal power, I like that, the peak of papal power, came with Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216. He was a very impressive figure. He had an aristocratic background. He was able, he was trained in canon law, civil law and theology, and he was a skillful negotiator and diplomat. He believed the Pope was the vicar of Christ, was the successor of Peter, therefore he was superior to any human act. We're looking at 1200 when the Pope is talked about as the successor of Christ. People talk about it going back to St. Peter. No. It's 1200 when that comes out quite clearly. And the argument is that Pope is superior to all human acts because all human acts are sinful. And the Pope's not. So, therefore, very important. Pope Innocent even interfered in the German election. He declared it void and appointed his own person to the position of King of Germany. So he was really powerful, but he was limited. He didn't manage to succeed with King John of England. Poor old King John. The Pope couldn't save him, couldn't rescue him. Now, we're going to do the Crusades. We might stop here and see if we can get this working, I think. So have your cup of tea. The next lecture is going to be a lot longer. All right, we'll just go back and do some of the things you didn't see before, all right? It's the book of Kells. You can see the kind of intricate work that goes into it. Absolutely, people just sat there and spent an hour. I don't know that helps you understand the gospel at all, but it's incredible workmanship, that's the thing. Okay, now these are icons. So you have Mary and Jesus, and Jesus with the children, and this is an Orthodox church, and you can see this here, the priest does everything behind that, so it's all secret. But you can see that you have, and all of these will have a story to them, and all paintings or mosaics, and then there'll be statues all around the church. So that's what I mean by icons. Okay? All right, the Crusades. See, I told you you'd be excited when you saw that. Let's go. Islam grew rapidly, and they captured most of the Holy Land, or all of the Holy Land. And so in 1095, Pope Urban II, a forerunner of Keith Urban and as useless as Keith Urban, Pope Urban II, sorry, my program on the radio is a Keith Urban free zone.
I know what you're talking about.
Everything sounds the same and it's horrible. Anyway, Pope Urban II at a convocation, that is a big meeting in France, preached. From the confines of Jerusalem And from the city of Constantinople, a horrible tale has gone forth. An accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and depopulated them by the sword, plundering and fire. Okay, so it's a race alienated from God because Allah is God, not Yahweh is God, and you don't understand any of that. They're pagans, because they don't believe our God. He listed Turkish atrocities, desecration of churches, rape of Christian women, torture and murder of Christian men. And then he says, start upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre to tear that land from the wicked race and subject it to ourselves. And the people cried, use fault! God wills it! God wills it! And that became the cry of the Crusades. Every warrior had to wear a sign of cross on his clothing, and there was recruitment throughout Europe. Now, when you look at the old school history books, for example, the Crusaders are lovely Anglo-Saxon types in armour, riding majestic steeds, really incredible. The average height of a Crusader was 5'3".
You're a giant. You're a giant.
They had whatever horses they could find, and they didn't have armour, they had leather coats, because armour was far too expensive. Now, it was the Eastern Church that had invited them to come and do the bit, but the first crusade, the first army arrived, 50,000 of them. The Eastern Church wanted some mercenaries to help us out, and they got 50,000. How do you feed them? How do you look after them? And of course, when they came, they also they were soldiers away from home. And so relations weren't good between the East and the West. They had success along the eastern Mediterranean coastline because Islam was divided and was fairly weak because of divisions within it. 1147, the Second Crusade, was encouraged by the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux. It was led by Louis VII of France and Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, a crusade led by the King of France and the King of Italy, if you like. When it fails, you start asking questions. But it failed to take Damascus, and after 2 years, the forces melted away. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, now they've actually put 1, 2, 3, 4 up there and a few others. There are probably 12 or 13 in all. Anyway, the Fourth Crusade, they attacked Constantinople. At least 2,000 citizens were killed, mosques were destroyed, the city was looted, many Roman treasures were captured or destroyed, and artworks were destroyed. If you go to Istanbul today, the old Colosseum or circus is there, the racetrack, and it was quite glorious in its day. There are still some pillars in the middle, some statues and pillars and things, but most of what was there you can find in museums in England or Spain or whatever, because it was carted off. The rest of it was just simply destroyed. The Hagia Sophia, which was became a mosque and is now a museum. If you stand in the middle of it, and it's just a big open space, the area that at the front was the Christian altar has things in the wall because it's got to point to Mecca, and the church doesn't point to Mecca because it was a Christian church. You stand in the middle of the floor of this magnificent building, and you realise that the Muslims stood there as the Crusaders came in on horseback and simply cut them down until the floor was running in blood. And then they brought mules in to take out all of the treasures. Now, you go into a mosque, you've got to take your shoes off. It's a holy place. So you can imagine the effect that had. And it really is a stain on Christian history. It really is one of the black points of Christian history. Some were successful, some of the Crusades, some were pathetic. Any takes they took had all been lost again by 1299. It was a holy war, it was a pilgrimage to a holy place. It was done for religious motives by the leaders. But how do you get soldiers to go and do that? Well, the first thing, you offer them immunity from taxes and debt payment. If you're a scoundrel and owes a lot of money, you go to the Crusades, you won't have to repay it. It's fantastic. You don't get the best class of soldiers. You get protection of property and family. One of the worst things you see when you go off to war in this age is that you lose everything because people left behind. And if you watch the movie Robin Hood, and it probably was never a Robin Hood, but that doesn't matter. He starts out at the Crusades, and when he comes back, his family and his farm have been wiped out, and so he becomes an outlaw. That's the Robin Hood story in the movie. But as a historian, let me tell you, there was no Robin Hood, but that's another matter. What was promised was that you would not lose your property. Your family would be protected while you were away. Obviously, it didn't always happen. And you were given indulgences guaranteeing an entry into heaven after a reduced time in purgatory. It caused a split between the East and the Western churches. The East has to live with these people. The West come in with barbarism, so obviously the East is not happy. The East is not happy because all these people come in and ruin their situation as well. They never recovered the Holy Land. It didn't happen until 1947 when England said, oh, I'm going to do it. And they strengthened the Ottoman Empire. Made it into one of the great empires of history. Basically, they show the very worst of Christian enthusiasm. And 800 years later, Pope John Paul II apologised, and rightly so. It really is one of the worst features of our history. Sacraments. They developed during the second 500 years. You know, we go back, this is New Testament stuff. Rubbish! And they developed in weird ways. Now we say there are only two sacraments, baptism and communion, or Eucharist. The Catholic Church has 7, baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, ordination, and matrimony. I suppose before we talk about them, we ought to work out what is a sacrament. And you will remember from the Catechism, it is an outward and visible sign of the inward and invisible grace.
Yes, that's the one.
Now explain it!
Just have to learn it.
I still remember finishing college with Broughton Knox's brilliant lectures and not having a clue why sacraments were important. Didn't understand them at all. And then a few years later, when I was on the college staff, Peter Jensen, who was the principal, later Archbishop of Sydney, rang me one morning and said, Denis, I'm supposed to be lecturing tonight and I'm sick. Will you do it for me? I said, yeah, sure, Peter, what am I lecturing on? He said, the sacraments.
Yay!
So I did what any historian did. I prepared a historical account of the development of the sacraments, hoping that I would get to the end of the lecture and not have time left to talk about what they actually meant. And I discovered, I actually understand them, because doing the historical research, I decided that 39 articles of the Anglican Church were originally written by Thomas Cranmer. There were 42 articles. And then the church later sort of reduced them to 39 and edited them. And I found a bit that actually made sense. It said, because I used to say, what's the significance of communion? I can do that and focus on Christ. Why is it a sacrament? And Cranmer had written that it had to do with the fact that we do it together. It's an act of fellowship. It's why we don't have baptism privately on a Sunday. You do it in church because it's an act of fellowship. And suddenly I thought, I understand it. I raced downstairs with Broughton Knox at that stage, long retired, was lecturing at the college. I raced down and knocked on his door and said, Broughton, look at this. Oh, I've never seen that before. And we sat and talked about it. And he said, oh, you must write an article, you've got to publish this. I never did. I probably should have, but I never did. But actually, I now understand sacraments. Anyway, there are two of them. And it's things we do together that make them effective. Baptism. After the problem with Pelagius over original sin, the teaching became baptism was necessary for salvation. So if you're not baptised, guess what? You go to hell. So unbaptised babies go to hell, or they go to limbo, which is on the borders of hell. And that's why, with a high rate of infant mortality, a baby is baptised as soon as its head appears. And if there's no priest there to do it, the midwife can do it, that's fine. It's got to be baptised or it doesn't get to heaven. Now, if it's a sacrament, confirmation was a problem because there were so many people baptised, the bishop never had a chance to confirm them. And so confirmation didn't happen, but you had to be confirmed to be ordained. That was the bottom line. Communion. In the 8th century, Radbertus, the abbot of Corby, wrote a treatise on the body and blood of the Lord. And that's probably the first clear statement of the doctrine of transubstantiation. So that's the 8th century. This document, this doctrine that causes so much trouble today, even in our diocese, a huge source of controversy, dates back to the 7th century, the 8th century. Christians are quick to accept it. In the 8th century, there was controversy about the use of unleavened bread, so wafers were used. They come from the 8th century. Ratranimus in the 9th century was one of the last of the medieval teachers to describe the elements as symbols, and his book was condemned as heresy in 1050. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 adopted transubstantiation as orthodox. So it's there from 1215 onwards. This ain't ancient stuff. It isn't. Problem with transubstantiation is you need to build the service up to a climax because, you see, it's an altar and Christ is sacrificed. It's being sacrificed all over again. There's no altar in the Anglican Church, it's a table. But it's an altar if you're going to sacrifice Jesus all over again. So you build it up to adoration. And as soon as the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Jesus, you worship it. It's the body and blood of Jesus. The lay people can't have wine because they might spill it. And you can't spill the blood of Jesus. And atonement is made in that. And the Bible says Christ's death is for the living and the dead. Why don't we have masses for the dead? And so that introduces that. It's a horrible doctrine. Still being used. The 7 sacraments from Peter Lombard of the 12th century, accepted by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. Confirmation is a sacrament. Penance, which is, when you say your Hail Marys after confession to the priest. Extreme unction, whether you anoint the dead body with oil. Ordination. And matrimony. Now you see, if a sacrament provides, if it's a sacrament and it's sealed when it occurs, you can't get divorced because you can't undo marriage. It's the background of the Catholic view on divorce. Not that the Bible says you can't get divorced. It's a sacrament. You can't get divorced. I wonder sometimes, we have people, I don't think our bishop believes in this, but we do have people in the diocese who do. We keep getting letters about clergy who have been defrocked because of the Royal Commission and so on. If ordination is a sacrament, how do you get rid of a clergyman? You can't. He's that forever. It raises all sorts of issues. But the biggest issue is, of course, where did Christ institute these? He talked about some of them, like the marriage, but that's all. So, we are the Church of the Word and the Sacraments, but the sacraments are baptism and communion, full stop. And the 39 Articles, which are the basis of our belief, say precisely that. The other five sacraments are not sacraments, they're fake. It's why High Church people didn't want the 39 Articles printed at the back of the modern prayers. And evangelicals forced them to put them there, because they simply don't believe any of them. Now this then gives rise to purgatory. We talked about transubstantiation. Purgatory, which is the waiting place for cleansing before entry into heaven. It's based on 2 Maccabees, chapter 12, verses 42 to 45. 2 Maccabees is part of the Apocrypha. They're the books that are in the Greek Bible, not the Hebrew Bible. They come from the period between 400 BC and the birth of Christ, a time when there is no prophets. And so it can't be scripture according to the Jews, but the Greeks accepted it. There's some very good history in them, very interesting to read, but there's a lot of rubbish too. And there's things like this. That's where it comes from. It was first defined at the Second Council of Wyong in 1274. Now, I'm sure it had been around for a long time before that, but that's when it's made Catholic doctrine. So when somebody dies, they go to purgatory, you pray for them, you say masses for them, and the more prayers and the more masses, the shorter their time in purgatory before they get into heaven. Now, it's actually a very comforting doctrine. When someone that you love dies and you don't think they're going to heaven because they're not really a Christian, it's nice to know they go to purgatory and you might be able to sort of help them along. It's very comforting. Wrong! That's very comforting. The Mormons decided that, hey, well, it's not a bad idea. So they have baptisms for the dead. Now, you probably don't realise, every time you use Ancestry.com, that's a Mormon site. The Mormons have collected all of those things, not because they want you to find your family history, because they're wonderful family historians. They want you to find your ancestors so that you can get baptised for them. So they get into heaven. That's the basis of Mormon ancestry sites. It's all about finding your ancestors so that they can be baptised and therefore get into heaven. Well, there is no justification for holding those things. Really, no justification. Well, a number of people there, because we're lacking in time, I just want to briefly mention them, just in case you come across them when you're reading something. Sometime the name will pop up, you at least have heard of them. Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090 to 1153. He bridged the age of feudal values and the growth of towns and universities. Feudal society, you had very small towns, and the fields were around the town. So what you have is a village which might only have half a dozen houses. And each of these families has its field out there. And so on. And you basically do your own thing, but there are enough of you to sort of help each other out. When the towns start, it's entirely different. The town is made up of lots and lots of people, enough people sometimes to have a university, and then farmers live out on their farms. They don't live in the town. So there's a big gap between rural people and urban people. Have you ever wondered in World War I why the British thought that the Turks would be so easy to conquer? The reason is Turkish society, apart from the big cities like Istanbul, is still ordered like this. You have villages and the people go out to their fields. And so the English thought the Turks were still living back in the feudal ages. They were still medieval. But in fact, they were very advanced people. And so they were underestimated. All because of this thing. Bernard of Clairvaux Bridge is the thing. Once you get a town, of course, you then start to get specialisation. Not everybody is fed by these people. They actually work for each other. So you get the craft guilds developing, and so you get, you know, your bootmakers and your bakers and your butchers and all that sort of thing. And when I say the butchers, that means the surgeons as well, because they were part of the butchers' craft guild. Not the medical, they were not medical people, they were butchers. He advocated self-denial, he called out rulers and the church for moral laxity, and he was very, very influential. Francis of Assisi, 1182 to 1226, he was wealthy, and he taught that your goods should be given to the poor, but he didn't just teach it, he did it. He became poor because he gave everything away. He was a real example of what to do. And he believed that you should care for the poor and the sick. And the Christian tradition of hospitals, and all that, it's all from this sort of period. He enjoyed the solitary life. It was probably forced on him, but he enjoyed it anyway. Now, it's said, all of the myths are up, but it's said that even the birds and the animals enjoyed his preaching. And that's why the legend grows up of Francis of Assisi being the patron saint of animals and all that sort of thing. It's all based on that. They loved his preaching. And because he was a man of action, he saw that as the villages gave way to cities, cities produced poverty. Every time you have a city, you have the rich and the poor, and the urban poor can't feed themselves as these people did because they've got farms, so they starve. And so he gave up the solitary life to go into the cities to work amongst the poor. Incredible figure. Incredible figure. Anselm, 1033 to 1109, he went across with Willie the Conqueror as part of the Norman invasion of England, and he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. He insisted on regular synods, so people actually should know what was going on. He enforced celibacy, and the slave trade was suppressed. He was a philosopher, and he was the first person to produce the ontological argument for the existence of God. John, you want to explain that? Because I can't. The ontological argument look, it goes in the page, but basically it is this. Because you think that there is a God who is greater than anything we know, there must be a God. Because I think it, there must be. Now, it's a little more complex than that, but that's the essence of it. I've never used it to convert anybody, and I never will, and I can't say I understand it, but that's basically what he puts forward. He also believed that Christ's death satisfied for sin, which is good. Peter Abelard, 1079 to 1142, he framed his theology in the world, not in the universities, not in the monasteries, out in the world. And so his theology is interesting. He talked about the relationship between faith and reason. And the question is, where is the ultimate authority between faith and reason? It's a forerunner to Luther. Luther says the ultimate authority is the Bible, is faith. It's a battle that still goes on today between faith, reason, tradition and emotion. Right? What's superior, the Bible, human reason, the tradition of the church, or the Spirit? And all different positions treat them slightly differently. We believe the Bible is central, but we accept that you have to use reason to interpret it. We accept that the church, what the church has taught in the past we need to look at, and we accept a certain amount of human experience being important. If you're a charismatic, you accept that experience is what matters and everything else is subservient to it. If you're a liberal, you say reason is the top of it and everything else. And if you're an Anglo-Catholic or a Catholic, you say the church's tradition is what's superior and everything else has to fit in with it. But it's Abelard who actually sets up that argument. And it's a very important argument, very important at the time of Luther. Thomas Becket, 1162 to 1170, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he believed the church courts ought to be independent of the general law. That runs him into conflict with Henry II, and of course Shakespeare wrote a whole play about it. That's how we know about Thomas Becket, most of us, although he was a very significant historical figure. He's an example of Christian conscience. He died for what he believed. And Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, he's probably the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages. He wrote commentaries on most Bible books, and he did an exposition of Christian doctrine. His importance is that he is still the basis of Roman Catholic theology. If you are a Roman Catholic theologian, you study Thomas Aquinas more than you study anything else. So the theology comes from 1225 to 1274. All right. Interpreting the Bible. The fall of the Roman Empire led to widespread illiteracy and ignorance. The Greeks and the Romans were very strong on education. And indeed, if you want to study the basis of education, their education systems are vital. Willie Barclay, whose commentaries I use all the time, he wrote his PhD thesis on the educational ideals of the ancient world. And we've learned a lot since he wrote it, but let me tell you, it's absolutely fascinating. When the Roman Empire fell, all that fell. Education was no longer significant. Only monastic people studied the scripture. Medieval theologians actually taught Scripture could only be studied by the learned few. It had to be studied under the direction of the church. And you didn't need to go back to Scriptures, you just need to go back to the early Christian writers. And so one theologian said, it is better not to be taken up with supposedly new ideas, but to be filled from the fountains of the ancients. You didn't need to go back to the Bible, you just needed to read Origen and those, and you got all that you needed to know. They produced massive volumes of dogma and morality, which claimed to explain Scripture, but which had very little connection with the biblical text. They used a fourfold method of interpretation. The literal teaches the events, allegory teaches what you are to believe, moral sense what you are to do, anagogical, which is the spiritual, what you aim for. But then you had to interpret those things. So let's take water. Water, literally, means water, wet stuff. Allegorically, it can refer to baptism, or to the nations, or to grace in the various commentaries of the day. Morally, it refers to sorrow, wisdom, heresy, or prosperity, and spiritually it means eternal happiness. The bottom line is the only qualification you needed to be a Bible interpreter in the Middle Ages was imagination. The better your imagination, the better your commentary was going to be. So I'll give you an example. Joel 2:16 says, "Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber." Now, you have no idea what that means. So let the medieval scholars tell you. It means let Christ go out of the bosom of the Father and the Christ from the virgin womb. Ah, it's very clever. It's not right, but it's very clever. And good imagination. Scholasticism used reason to try to get over that, but it was dry and led to even more mysticism and even more fanciful stuff. Bernard of Clairvaux, who we've mentioned, wrote 86 sermons on the Song of Solomon. I never preached one sermon on the Song. I can't understand the Song of Solomon, I'm sorry. 86 sermons on the Song of Solomon. The only qualification you need is imagination. You can go anywhere you like. The Franciscan mystic Bonaventura taught that the Virgin Mary wrote the Book of Psalms. There, take that. In this period, the only people who were actually taking the scriptures seriously were the Jews. They were producing really good stuff. But like every period of history, you don't listen to them. You don't pay any attention to them. But Jewish scholarship was far better than all of this other rubbish that was going on. Now you see, even if the parish priest and the laity actually discover this stuff, it ain't going to help them one little bit, is it? But that's what's going on. It's all going on up there in the monasteries and so on, but you know what a theologian is, don't you? A theologian is someone who gives answers nobody can understand to questions nobody's asking. There was a huge building boom of cathedrals and churches. You look at in all your English detective shows and so you look at some of the churches and you think, how on earth did you ever get enough people to even fill a tenth of it? I can remember in Scotland visiting the so-called grave of Rob Roy. It's not his grave, but it's where he grew up, but that's all right. There's an old church which has fallen into ruin. And so they built a new church, I think, in the 19th century. And it's massive, it's beautiful, it's massive. You can't find any houses around it. I mean, and in its heyday, when everybody went to church, you couldn't have had more than 40 or 50 people. There'd seats probably 300. You couldn't have got them there because there's nobody around. But you built churches because they were important. There were two styles, the Roman style and the Gothic style. And you may notice that we still use those styles in churches. Yeah. You know, as I keep telling people, this is not a church. This is actually useful. It's practical. They can't possibly be a church, can it? These are totally useless, but they're magnificent. The Roman style had the arched ceiling, usually of cement, and it made it very heavy. And so you had to have huge pillars in the church to hold it up. You had to have small windows because you couldn't weaken the walls with windows. And so you actually had all these bright tapestries and all sorts of other things. Now you realise that if you're sitting here, you can see what's happening up there. If you're sitting in the side aisle, you can't see a thing. That's what they built them. The Gothic style is better. It's really intricate design, but it's better because you see they don't have pillars holding them up. They have external supports holding up the walls. And so the inside is much more open. You can have classic stained glass windows, all of that sort of thing, because of these outside buttresses replace the pillars. Now they're the two main styles. By the end of the 12th century, they've reached their sort of height, but churches are still to this day being built in similar designs. And here in Australia, of course, we still have these really steep roofs because we want to keep the snow off all the churches in the Sydney diocese. That's the way. Let's move on. Popular religion. In the Middle Ages, the people needed a concrete expression of their faith, since there was a lack of any sort of intellectual understanding. And so the veneration of saints become really important. And as I said, the Gnostic idea, they're up there. They're good people that are up there, and God's listening to them, so you pray to them and they'll pass your prayers on to God, because afterward He's not going to listen to you because you're too ordinary. The worship of the Virgin Mary becomes more and more significant. Relics and shrines become important, and pilgrimages become important. Heroic efforts to look after the Holy Land, that sort of thing. A lot of pagan traditions were retained but given a sort of Christian veneer. In the 12th century, devotion, therefore Mary becomes even more important. She's the great intercessor. Believed the body and soul are taken up into heaven. Introduced the rosary from the east with prayers to Mary. Emphasis on the humanity of Christ, so you almost fall in love with Mary. She's his mother and the great protector, and she becomes a romantic obsession. Chivalry is based on the worship of Mary, and therefore you have to treat all women who are mothers with a great deal of respect, and that's sort of part of the chivalric tradition. The growth of devotion meant a traffic in holy relics. Every new church needed a relic for its altar. And if you could get the bone of Paul's arm, that was great, you see. And if you couldn't buy one, you stole one from one of the other churches. That's the way to do it. Merchants carried a splinter from the cross. I mean, the cross was a skyscraper, but that's another story. You carried a splinter from the cross to protect you from thieves. Knights concealed saints' bones, teeth or hair in their sword hilts for protection. And bodies of famous saints were stolen by cities, and they ended up all over the place. Pilgrimage was based on the belief that visits to the great shrines brought physical healing and spiritual healing. That's based on a desire to visit holy places. The Holy Land was hard and dangerous, so that was the ultimate pilgrimage. But otherwise, Rome, Canterbury, or even local sites where saints had done something magnificent. Now, they were highly organised. There were set routes, and inns were set up along the way so that you did a day's travel, and then you stayed at the inn, were fed, you slept, and then you moved on, and there's another inn at the next bit. They were light-hearted, singing and dancing. I mean, you're going on a religious pilgrimage, but it's a holiday as well. So you've got to mix the two. And of course there is, if you've ever read the Canterbury Tales, let me recommend the Classics Illustrated version. Don't read the actual book itself. Fascinating stuff. I once passed a university exam on the Canterbury Tales. I still have a copy of the book, which has interleaved in every page my translation of it, because I couldn't read it. I had to sit down and painstakingly translate it, because it's in Old English, which is not our English. It's fascinating, you know, it's a religious pilgrimage, and it's a lot of drunkenness and a lot of immorality, but it's a religious pilgrimage on the way to Canterbury. Monasticism, Daily life of a monastic, the yellow bits of the church. So you get up at 1:30 in the morning, meditation, this is summer, meditation. Winter you actually get to stay until 2:30. Yeah, winter's good. 1:30, meditation and reading. Then you go to church, that's matins, and the reformers take all these services and put them together into morning prayer and evening prayer. Then you sleep for another quarter of an hour. I don't know how you do that. Have another church service, meditation and reading, another church service, meditation and reading, another church service. Then you go to work, another church service, then you get to eat. I think you get a snack somewhere in here, but I'm not sure. You get to sleep in the middle of the day, you actually get an hour or so there. Another church service, more work. You get to eat, another church service, meditation, reading, another church service, you go to bed. There ain't much time for anything else, is there? And that's a typical monastic day. Work that they did, most of them spent most of their time copying ancient manuscripts. There are a lot of ancient manuscripts, we don't have the originals, we only have copies that were made in monasteries, which is very helpful. They were related to the local community often because they were given land and they often sold their produce to the local community. They prayed for the local people and they did penance for them. And then each order develops its own. Now the standard thing is that eventually the monks withdraw from work, and what they have are lay members, the uneducated poor, who go into the monastery but never actually become monks. They do all of the hard work. It's a good system, and monasteries often become very, very rich. By 1300, there are 600 monasteries and nunneries in Europe. A lot of scholarship, but as you can see from that, the world doesn't ever get to see it. The Inquisition is very important. Let's deal with it very quickly. The Inquisition was to sort out heresy, and it worked very simply. The Inquisitor, who is here, has a whole lot of helpers, and actually there are dozens of them. It's done in secret, the doors are closed, and you can be arrested simply on suspicion. And it's suspicion of intentions as well as actions. Very hard to prove intentions.
Right.
And the trial might go for a whole half a dozen years, in which case you're held in prison. It's usually easier to confess than defend yourself. And if you confess to something really bad, of course, you get put to death, you get burnt at the stake or whatever. If it's not something really bad, then you get all sorts of punishments. The Spanish Inquisition was the Great Inquisition. You like blood and ghoul and so on, read about that. France and Italy, the Inquisition was good. Germany wasn't bad. England didn't have an Inquisition. So, your ancestors were too sophisticated. Take heart in that. Let's look at papal problems very quickly. Finances were reformed by Boniface VIII in 1294 to 1303. He limited the power of kings to tax clergy. There are all sorts of controversies. He did some good things. The Archbishop of Bordeaux was elected Pope. He became Clement V in 1305. He moved the papacy to Avignon in France. He never actually visited Rome in his entire life. So now the papacy is in France, not in Rome. And you can imagine the kind of problems that causes. The following popes were therefore all French. And then Pope Urban V returned the papacy to Rome because Avignon became too dangerous, but the French still dominated. And then basically the popes forgot spiritual leadership, offered favours and money, it was all corrupt. 1381 there was a great split. between Urban VI of Rome and Clement VI of Avignon. Urban VI of Rome was supported by Italy, as you'd expect, Scandinavia, Hungary, and England. Clement V, French, so you'd expect France and Spain. And of course, if England supports the Roman one, Scotland supports the French one, don't they? Now, got to be clear about these things. There was an attempt to heal the split, didn't happen. So the Council of Pisa in 1409, Pisa I think is better, but Pisa, the popes refused to attend, so the cardinals deposed them both and appointed Alexander V. So now you've got three popes, all claiming to be there. The Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418. Imagine a 4-year synod. We think one Saturday's too much. 4 years! Two of the popes resigned. The one that was left was deposed. 1417, Martin V became the sole pope, and it went downhill from there. You can't read history and believe in the papacy. I'm sorry. That's the bottom. It's this old thing. If you are never taught history, you can be taught anything you like. If you read history, you cannot have any respect for the papacy. All right, let's have a look at life at the beginning of the 16th century. The features of the church included negligence, ignorance and absenteeism and sexual immorality, and that's just the clergy. That's just the clergy. Negligence, I didn't actually know what their duty was because of ignorance. You know, imagine that they haven't got a clue what they're supposed to be doing. And so a lot of them aren't even there. Absenteeism, they ain't bothered to go to the parish. They all have other jobs. I mean, that continues after the Reformation in the church. You like Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll? Lewis Carroll wasn't his name, but he was actually a minister, an Anglican minister. The first gold discovered in Australia was discovered by William Clark, Reverend William Clark, who was a geologist as well as an Anglican minister. And so on. But at least they had some sort of interest in it. But if you were doing these other things, you just got a curate to look after the church. You paid him a pittance, you took most of the money, and you went off and did your own thing. That's the way it was. And sexual immorality, well, you leave the Bible out of it, that's what you get. There was corruption and official sanction of corruption. It was the papal protection of abuses. Now, the church suffered, I don't know how we're going to get here, but anyway, the church suffered from a number of problems. The biggest problem was the plague. The plague began in 1347. The Black Death killed about a third of the Catholic West. It went on. It didn't get to England until 1665. A huge death toll from the plague. And the other was the Ottoman Turks, who were getting stronger and stronger and stronger. It was also the age of exploration. Europe was actually expanding. I found this fascinating because, I've been studying this for years and I'd never realised this. When Luther was 5 years old, Bartholomew Diaz sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. When Luther was 9 years old, Columbus discovered America, or what he thought was America. When Luther was 15 years old, Vasco da Gama opened up the sea route to India. And during his lifetime, Cabot, Cortez, Magellan and Pizarro all went on their great journey. Now, you've probably heard of Cabot, Cortez, Magellan. You haven't heard of Pizarro. He went to Peru. We don't talk about Peru, so you never hear about that. But all of that happened in Luther's lifetime. So you've got all these other problems. And guess what? Remember we said The gospel was able to be taken out because God chose the very time that it was possible, when the Roman peace, the Roman roads, the Roman language. The Reformation occurs at the very time new lands are being discovered. Very interesting. You may actually think that God knew what he was doing. It was possible. Possible. Now look, people knew that things were wrong. The church was not a New Testament model. Reform was needed. The history books talk about all the bad things. There were good clergy. There were faithful clergy. There were churches that preached the gospel. It's just that they don't make it in the history books because they're not worth reporting. But you don't ever think everything was bad. Look, we can do the next half hour in 3 minutes. How's that sound? The Renaissance was the revival of classical Greek and Roman, began with scholars known as humanists. That simply meant that they understood Greek and Hebrew as well as Latin. And so they actually went back to the original texts. And suddenly they were discovering all sorts of things. You remember Galileo, great hero, he discovered the earth goes around the sun. Well, the Greeks knew that. It's all there in the documents. And so these people actually go back and go, oh, hang on. This wonderful thing was that the Greeks knew it. Way back, way back. The most important event was the Gutenberg printing press, which enabled literature to be produced. And the key figure was Erasmus. Now, I think at university we did 3 or 4 lectures on Erasmus, and I'm just going to pass him over. But he was a great thinker who paved the way for the reformers. I want to finish with 2 people because I really want to be able next term to start the Reformation at the Reformation. The first is John Wycliffe. For those who are writing things down, and there are some people doing that, John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was 1329 to 1384, born in the north of England. He was a philosopher at Oxford University. He actually backed the rights of the government to take property off corrupt clergy. That'll wake him up. He was condemned by the Pope, of course. He attacked some central doctrines of the medieval church. Transubstantiation, he said it wrong. Christ is spiritually present in the Eucharist. Now, don't ask for an explanation of that, because I can't give it, because I'm not sure Wycliffe knew. He just knew transubstantiation. Transubstantiation was wrong. Christ was there as a spiritual presence. We'll deal with all of that when we come to Calvin, Luther and Zwingli and look at what happens there. The church was God's chosen people. You didn't need a priest to mediate for you. You certainly didn't need a bishop. Good, great guy. Forced out of Oxford, he was a prolific author. He translated the Vulgate, that's the Latin Bible we talked about last week, into English. And that's a page from Wycliffe's Bible. Even if we tied it up, you still wouldn't be able to read it, but that doesn't matter. He believed that the main task of the priest was to preach, and the Bible should be available to everyone in his own language. And the second great, and we'll finish with this, was William Tyndale. William Tyndale was educated at Oxford, probably went to Cambridge as well. He was a tutor to the family of Sir John Walsh, and there he actually met a number of clergy. And he said to one cleric, "If God spare my life ere many years pass, I will cause a boy that driveth the plough to know more of the Scriptures than you do." And that became his life's work, to make the Scripture available to the worker in the field. His English Bible was banned in 1408. Wycliffe had translated the Vulgate into English. That meant it contained a whole lot of errors for reasons we talked about with translations last week. Tyndale went back to the Hebrew and the Greek. He translated the whole New Testament in 1525, but he only translated some of the Old Testament before he was put to death. Because you can't translate the Bible into English. That's not possible. Now, he's been called the father of the English Bible because if you go to the King James Version of the Bible, 90% of it in 1611 is Tyndale. That's a lot. Go to the RSV in 1948 for the New Testament and 52 for the Old Testament. 75% is Tyndale. I mean, the words have been updated, but it's Tyndale's translation. And the grammar's been sort of modernised and so on. I don't know about you, but I think that makes him one of the great heroes of history. He was betrayed and arrested near Brussels in 1535, and he was strangled and burnt for translating the Bible into English. Don't we have it easy? All right, thank you for putting up with it going so long. We next go to the Reformation. Next term, and on the sheet we have the dates